Good evening. 6:30. Welcome. So if in the first class we covered something like 1,000 years in an hour, today we're going to cover hardly 3 years in an hour. Next week we will not have a class. And then, as I mentioned last time, I just wanted to take a break of a month with Zionism and the history of Israel. And for me, the best way to take a break is to switch to a completely different kind of studying. And one of the fields in which I have been spending a lot of time reading, thinking, is the question, it's called either the question of evil or the question of suffering. Or in other words, why bad things happen to good people, or the reverse, why good things happen to bad people. This is a question that not only Jews, but many philosophers, theologians, religions try to deal with. And frankly, it's a question that I think each and every one of us is dealing with quite often. And it brings us to really to different way of thinking, not only about evil and suffering, but about God, about ourselves, about relationships. So I decided to dedicate, not next week, but the 3 weeks following, I think it starts on at the 11th of February, to explore some fascinating Jewish texts that attempt to offer us some way to understand this issue. And we'll cover texts from the Bible, Talmud, Midrash, and even Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah that has a lot to contribute to this discussion. I hope that you will come and you'll find it as fascinating as I do. So because we are taking a little break and changing the subject, I want to finish the pre-state of Israel, or in other words, to stop calling this land Palestine and to start calling it Israel. And when we continue, we'll start with the very beginning of Israel. Okay? So if you remember, last week we ended with, we talked about the great, or the Arab revolt from 1936 to 39. The Arabs revolted against the British, who controlled the land of Palestine at the time. They also attacked the Jewish community there. And as a result, the British sent a committee, the Peel Committee, that came to investigate what's happening, and they suggested for the first time ever a solution of partitioning, dividing the land of Palestine into two, a Jewish state alongside of an Arab state. This idea was rejected. 1939, many Jews arrived in Palestine, as many as they could, because things were really awful in Europe, right? Hitler came to power in 1933, and since then, it was really bad to be a Jew in Europe. More Jews came to Palestine. The tension between the Arabs and the Jewish people in Palestine got worse for clear reasons. And I spoke a little bit about the idea of a third. The Jews in the mid-1930s became third of the population of Palestine. And just remember, only a few years before, they were a tiny minority, a single-digit minority. Okay, and all of a sudden they are third. And it's not only that their numbers grew, they bought a lot of land, because it's not only the immigrant who bought the land. Most of them did not have the money. It was JNF for the most part, Jewish National Fund. Some of you planted trees in Israel through them and other things. But their main goal was to buy land in Palestine and to give it to Jews. They bought it mainly from Arabs. And what happened to the people who lived on these lands, the peasants? They got kicked out. So now the Palestinians who used to live on the same land for hundreds and hundreds of years, between 40 and 50% of them became landless. Okay, and they went to all these shanty places, lived in outskirts of cities. Most of them were unemployed. They were extremely poor. Now, you can blame the Arab landlords or landowners who sold the land to the Jews, or you can blame the Jews, or both. But what they saw was the Jews are coming and we are being kicked out. Okay, so the legality of it, or the Arabs who got rich over it, was not their main concern. 1939, ironically and painfully, with the beginning of the Holocaust, the British issued the White Paper. And for our purpose, the most important part of the White Paper, please join us. And do we have more of that? Oh, Adele is the holder of the printout. And the worst part of the White Paper was that the British limited Jewish migration to Palestine and reduced it to 75,000 in 5 years. So as the Nazis were killing the Jews all over Europe, the British did not allow more than 15,000 Jews to come to Palestine. And now when we have an access to these certificates, they didn't even issue the 75,000. They issued only 47,000. Okay, so during the Holocaust, when our families were burning in Europe, the British had a navy blockade preventing the Jews from immigrating to Palestine. Of course, America did the same and other nations did the same, but Palestine or Israel was the place of the Jews, and they thought that they could go there, especially after the important Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British promised that the Jews will establish a home for the Jews, a Jewish home in Palestine. So they knew that one day Palestine will become a Jewish homeland, and now 39, they are being killed, and no homeland, just major restrictions on their ability to migrate to Palestine. Okay, so that's where more or less we ended. Let's skip the Holocaust. It's really important, but not for this class. I want to start today at the end of the Holocaust, 1945. Holocaust is over, World War II is over. There are millions of people in Europe without a home. Refugees, or as they prefer to call them in a cleaner way, displaced persons. There were millions of displaced persons. About 250,000 of them were Jewish. And the Jewish had even a worse position than the others. First of all, anti-Semitism in Europe did not end with World War II. In some places, it even increased. In my house, it was okay to talk about the Germans, but never about the Polish, because my grandparents hated the Polish much more than they hated the Germans. Because when the war was over, the Polish kept killing Jews. I won't talk too much about it. I said no Holocaust, but they didn't want Jews to reclaim their homes, their possessions. You know, the Jews were forced to leave, and Polish families got into their homes. They didn't want the Jews to go back. They didn't want Jews to claim their stores, their businesses, their possessions, right? So it was much easier to get rid of the Jews, to blame them for a lot of these things. So Jews could not really go to where they came from, to Poland, to Russia, to other places. They couldn't go to other places around the world. Nobody wanted them. So they stayed in the DP camp, displaced persons camps, all over Europe, a lot in occupied Germany, in Italy and Austria. My paternal grandparents met in one of these DP camps in Germany after each one of them had lost their original family. They got together and my father was born in a DP camp. Okay, but after the Holocaust, you think the war is over, but they had nowhere to go. Nobody wanted them. And why would they? They were broken people. They didn't have much to offer. Okay, so they were there. So this is the backdrop against which I think I want to start. And I want to share with you a report that very few people even know about. And that's the handout that I distributed, or Adele helped me to distribute, the Harrison report. I would be surprised if anyone had heard about it. Oh, we don't have enough? If you don't mind, wow, I made 40 copies. I thought that I overprinted. You memorized it, Bruce? Okay, so we have enough. We're not going to spend too much time, but Harrison, Errol Harrison was a famous lawyer in the 1940s. He was the dean of the Law School of University of Pennsylvania. Truman, who was the president, sent him to Europe to check on the DP camps, to see what was going on, because there were rumors and there wasn't so much TV and other media there. And so Truman wanted to have a report to know what was happening there. And I want us to read some of the quotes. I just collected some important quotes from the Harrison report. And why I chose to spend the time on that today, because some scholars believe that this report is one of the keys to the establishment of the State of Israel. This report affected Truman's opinion about the State of Israel, his willingness to give the Jews or to support a Jewish state in Palestine, okay? And of course, with the support of Truman, it was much easier, okay? So let me just read, because the language here is really, really strong, and it's good when you don't send a politician, you really send a person whom you want to investigate and give you the things as they are. I'm the only one with a microphone, so for the sake of our friends who watch us remotely, I will read. So this is the famous line from this report, and a really tough one. As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis. By we, he means we, the Americans. Okay, because he went to the American DP camps, the German territories controlled by America. Okay, so he was an American who was reporting to the American president. Okay, so we, the Americans, appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, expect that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. This is serious. Many of these camps had a barbed wire all around. They had walls. So yeah, they didn't kill the Jews. They gave them the basic they needed. They gave them much more food and clothing than the Nazis did. But they left concentration camps to go to another camp with barbed wire around and guards, etc. Okay, so when Harrison went, he said, oh my God, people couldn't believe that that's what you do with the survivors of the Holocaust. No matter that my grandparents were always, just forget about the hunger and the illnesses, just a psychological trauma. Many of the Jewish displaced persons, it is true, are no longer crowded together in cattle cars, but one must see the conditions under which they are housed in order to understand how little progress has been made in solving their problems. The world owes it to this handful of survivors to provide them with a home where they can again settle down and begin to live as normal human beings. This is crucially important. What is the key phrase here in the last thing that I read? The world owes it to them. We pretended not to notice when 6 million of them got murdered, or we were too busy surviving, whatever you want to say, or no matter how you want to explain it. But now we cannot deny what was happening there. We cannot deny the fact that we, as America, refused to bomb the concentration camps, the crematorium, etc. But now, at least, we owe it to them. And this report was read by Truman. Truman was not necessarily a lover of Jews. He was not a hater of Jews. Personally, he was a person, we all know, many of us know the story about his best friend from the army and partner, but Truman never had a Jew in his house. Okay, that was the culture, Jews were completely separate from non-Jews. But he was a religious man who tried to do the right thing. And for him, reading these reports, we owe it to them. Okay, this is really important. Let's read a little bit more. Palestine is definitely and preeminently the first choice, because there were some other ideas back then. Oh, let's send the Jews to other places. Uganda was one of them, okay? But the Jews didn't want to go there. That's not our ancestor. Oh, yes. Many of the others, it is true, have equally suffered, by the far greater number of Jews in Germany and Austria still look to Palestine as the one hope for permanent solution for their problem. Remember the phrase, the Jewish problem, that was coined by the Nazis, okay, of how to get rid of the Jews. This is a new Jewish problem. What to do with them? With the few who survived, few Europeans who survived the Holocaust. The first and plainest need of these people is a recognition of their actual status, and by this I mean their status as Jews, not as Polish, not as Russians, not as Germans, right? They were not executed as Polish people. They were murdered because they were Jewish. So let's recognize them as Jewish. They're not just Polish Russians, okay? That's super important. Refusal to recognize the Jews as such has the effect in this situation of closing one's eyes to their present plight and future fate. The only rational solution, in my opinion, would be the authorization of the immediate entry into Palestine of the 100,000, which would include a large proportion of children whose relatives in this country have already made application for their immigration and who are otherwise qualified for admission. So let's start with permission for 100,000. Now, the truth is that this is an exaggerated numbers because there weren't 100,000 Jews in the American-controlled DP camps. But who is it talking to really here now with the 100,000? To the British. He said, you have full control of the situation. You have the key to solve the problem. Open the gates to the Jews. Let's finish these DP camps, these refugee camps. The British hated this report. Okay, they took it personally. And it really caused a rift between America and Britain at the time. They ended up sending the Anglo-American committee to check a year later the DP camps, and they came up with a very similar report. To anyone who has visited concentration camps and who has talked with the despairing survivors, it is nothing short of calamitous to contemplate that the gates of Palestine should be soon closed. And it's insane. To these and other groups in Germany and Austria, Palestine, to which immigration had been permitted in past years under prescribed conditions, was the main, if not only, hope. The Jews who survived the Holocaust had no future, and that was the hardest thing. Okay, we're not going to be killed by the Germans, but we have no future. Can you just imagine having no future, no solution? We're in these camps, and a week passed, and a month passed, and a year passed, and another year passed, and nothing is happening. Okay, it's very easy to lose hope, especially after the Holocaust. What was the lesson from the Holocaust? Nobody really cares about us. So why would they start caring now? So yeah, it's true, they don't kill us, they give us some meager supplies and food, but so after the celebration of the end of the war, desperation started again. And let's just go to the call for action. I'm going to the last paragraph. The civilized world owes it to this handful of survivors to provide them with a home where they can again settle down and begin to live as normal human beings. We must recognize that they are a special group with special needs. Above all, we must not treat them as enemy nationals, which in the eyes of our military, many of them technically are, because they kept them in conditions like prisons. You send guards, soldiers, to protect or to guard them. Okay, they really treated them like enemy soldiers. Okay, so he said they're not enemies. Even if there are Germans in origin, they're the victims of the Germans. They are Jewish. They're no longer German. Okay, so this Harrison report that really people, very few know about it, I think is crucial to understand why or how Israel came about and what really affected Truman. I'm going to skip a tiny bit because it was not easy for Truman to support a Jewish state. This was 1945. 1947, the UN, now it's the UN, right? The United Nations, not the League of the Nations that was before, sent a special committee. It's called UNSCOP, UNSC, Special Committee, OP, of Palestine. Okay, remember, that's an important committee to remember. So the United Nations sent a delegation to Palestine, UNSCOP, to learn the situation there and to come up with a solution. One of the reasons that they did it was this report, because this report caused a lot of pressure in the world. Please join us. Oh, okay. it caused a great pressure in the world to take care of these poor Jews who survived the Holocaust. Okay, and by now everyone knew what happened and nobody could deny it, and there were many pictures and many documents, and okay, so there was strong pressure, and this delegation came to Palestine. For the most part, this delegation was quite honest. They had few members there who hated the Jews to begin with, but for the most part, they really came to learn. You know, they came with a tabula rasa, with really blank slate. Let's learn. And this is one of the most important lessons that we need to learn, not only politically speaking, but also individually speaking. So they came to Palestine to talk to the two main groups, the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews were about a third, the Arabs were 2/3, right? When they came to the Jewish areas, they were welcomed with parties, with celebrations, with food. In Tel Aviv, that's a video? Yeah, that's, I think. In Tel Aviv, they declared a national holiday in honor of this delegation. They talked to them. They gave them all the information. They did everything that they wanted. I think that's the... Initially, before a class, I include
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world.
you because this is our land. And then you come in order to decide what to do with our land. Okay, that was the argument of the Arabs, which makes some sense if you want, but here is the biggest lesson. When you don't sit at the table, you lose. So even if they had, let's say, the best argument, the best moral argument for why they shouldn't sit at the table and meet with the UN committee, the UN committee based most of its resolutions and recommendations on what they learned from the Jews. Okay, so sometimes we have this tendency, even in small groups, to get out of the table, to boycott, and normally those who boycott lose. They may make a huge statement by storming out. They may feel good for 3 minutes because it feels really powerful, right? I'm not talking to him, out of here. But often they lose. And the Palestinians, the Arabs, lost. Okay? And I will mention in a second in which way they lost. Now, I said something similar about the Peel Committee from 1937 that they didn't want to collaborate, but the Peel Committee was not so important. This is important. This is 1947, okay, a year before the foundation of Israel. Okay, so we're not playing, we don't want to talk to you. During the visit of UNSCOP, of the members of UNSCOP in Palestine, that's what happened.
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world. Largest illegal immigrant ship to date, the American vessel President Warfield, renamed Exodus 1947, arrives in Haifa with nearly 5,000 on board. In her wake follows the British destroyer, whose crew bore the brunt of a violent attack when the President Warfield was intercepted. Tear gas, smoke bombs and other weapons were used against the British boarding party before the ship's captain agreed to be escorted into harbor. British casualties included members of the Palestine police, while wounded immigrants were given medical care before being transferred to other ships. Another proof of the need for speedy and definite agreement on an international problem.
Paul Newman. This is the real thing. This. Sorry? If you want to find a field in which you never want to ask me a question, it's about movies. I know nothing, and when I watch a movie, after about 3 seconds, my memory is completely erased. I don't remember movies, I don't know movies. We can do books, we can do other things. Neither movies nor sports, know nothing about it. But I do know about Paul Newman because he was Jewish and everyone loved Paul Newman when I grew up, and we know the movie. But that is at least the story. The story was written by Leon Uris. Is based on a very important story of this ship that was later on renamed the Exodus. DP camps, remember? 250,000 Jews tried to come to Palestine. The British has a naval blockade over Palestine, and the British were good. Their navy was the best, right? The Haganah, the paramilitary group of the Yeshuv, the Jewish agency of the Jewish community in Palestine, decided to do something quite spectacular. They bought an extremely old, dilapidated boat from America and took it to France, to a little port near Marseille, and loaded it with 4,515 Jewish refugees during the British blockade, right? This ship was not meant to have 4,500 people, not even a fraction of that number, but they put everyone, right? There were no private rooms, or they were just sleeping. There are pictures of it everywhere, just a sleeping bag next to a sleeping bag, but as many people as they could. The British, of course, found out about it, but the Haganah, okay, the Israeli Yeshuv, did not try to hide it. In the contrary, they wanted the world to see what was happening. And they just did not think that the British, in front of the media, they invited people from everywhere, would dare not to allow these poor Holocaust survivors to enter Palestine. Well, they were wrong. The British certainly
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly...
Navy ships shot at the Exodus, killed many people. And the Exodus, the ship was in a horrible condition to begin with, and took them down to Haifa, to prison. And then they decided to deport them back to Cyprus. So what the British did during this time, they established in Cyprus sort of a prison for illegal immigrants. And they wanted to send the 4,515 Jews to Cyprus, only that they refused to disembark. So the British said, you don't want to go to Cyprus? No problem. Back to Europe. So they sent them back to France, where they came from. The Jewish people said, we're not leaving the boat. The French refused to force the Jewish people to disembark. And here is the sad irony. So the British took them to a DP camp in Germany. Okay, so the Holocaust survivors who somehow survived the Holocaust ended up back in Germany. Now, this story was a huge story in the world. Okay, so this little clip that I shared with you, millions of people all around the world saw. And at that time, it doesn't happen a lot in history, but they sympathized with the Jews. They knew about the Holocaust by now, and people just felt these poor people deserve a solution. They deserve their own home, okay? And here the British, again, are the bad guys. They don't allow them to go. They shoot at them, send them back to Germany. Okay, of course, there are horror stories about the St. Louis, you know what I'm talking about? That was a ship of Jewish immigrants who came to the US during the Holocaust, and the US sent them back to the concentration camps. But that was during the Holocaust when people were able to pretend that they didn't really know what was happening, but no pretending at that time. Okay, so that was a big deal, the story of the Exodus. I don't know how it is going, how it correlates to the movie, but I'm sure that the movie has a lot of kernels of historical truth in it. And if there is Paul Newman, probably there was a love story there, right? I really didn't watch it. I was planning to a few times and I didn't have the... In any case, when ANSCO, when the special committee for Palestine was in Palestine, guess what happened? The Exodus. They witnessed that with their own eyes. Okay? So the UN delegation just saw how these poor Jews tried to come to Palestine. The British Navy prevented them, shot at them, and forced them back to Germany 2 years after the Holocaust. It really affected them, even though they wouldn't say it explicitly, but how wouldn't it? Okay? So the Haganah, the paramilitary group, achieved what they wanted. If they wanted good PR, they got much more than they bargained for because they really did not believe that the British would not allow this group, this ship to come. By the way, they didn't go back to Europe on the Exodus because the Exodus was not in a shape to go back. So the British had prison boats for them. Okay? And okay, if you want to read more about it, it's rather devastating. So UNSCOP, the special committee, learned as much as they needed and went back to the UN with a report. And what they suggested is this. They suggested what is known as the partition plan. They said the Jews and the Arabs cannot live together. We cannot have one state for both of these peoples. We need to divide the state between the Jews and the Arabs. Okay, they have some suggestions. I won't get into detail. Let's look at the map. the blue or the turquoise or whatever color it looks there. Oh, my colors on the iPad are different than yours. So the bluish, grayish, beautiful color is the Jewish state. The, what is it, master color? I don't know. Is the Arab state. And the little white in the middle, you see, Jerusalem, is an international zone. Okay? Does not belong to anyone. Here is the information that you need to know about it. The Jews at the time in 1947 were 1/3 of the population. UNSCOP gave them 55% of the land. You heard correctly, I didn't make a mistake. So even though the Jews were outnumbered 1-3, they got the majority of the land. That's what happens when you don't want to talk to the committee. That's not the only reason, okay? Because UNSCOP took into consideration the future immigration of Jews and the Holocaust survivors, etc. But they gave the majority of the land to the minority group. The Jews accepted it. There was, of course, one group, the revisionists, or the people of the Irgun, who didn't, because they wanted everything. More than that, they also wanted Jordan to be part of the Jewish state. Not only that, but the Jews wanted it. And from the very beginning, they said, let's start with it. And in the future, we may get more. But at least, let's have a state. And if that's the best we can get, we will take it. There was criticism of Ben-Gurion. Remember Ben-Gurion, probably the most important person you have to know. He was the head of the Yeshuv, or the Jewish Agency, the de facto government of the Jews in Palestine. And he accepted it. He said it's a good deal for us. It was criticized, of course, even by his own son. And later on, they found a letter that he wrote to his son and said, son, sometimes you have to take what you can get and not what you want, because without it, we have no future. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs absolutely didn't. Okay? They were against it. They started riots again for many good reasons. When you, again, we try to look at it also from their perspective. This has been our land. And then people from the UN, which was a new organization at the time, so these people come and decide how to divide our land. In addition, we're the majority, and we got the smaller portion of the land. And if you remember a few classes ago, when the British promised a Jewish state in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, they also promised a huge Arab state in the entire territory of the Ottoman Empire that included Palestine. So Palestine was promised both to the Jews as well as to the Arabs. Okay? So they say now the Jews are getting so much, and what about us? We also have the right for self-determination, and it seems like the Jews get it all. And they said something else that resonates with me. And it's very important. It's one of the most crucial lines that in everything that I read. They said we have sympathy for the Jews. They really suffered. We acknowledge it. Because they also knew. They lost 6 million people. 1/3 of their people was eliminated. But, and this is the but, they said the world wants us to pay for the crimes of the Europeans. It's the Europeans who killed the Jews, not the Arabs. And who is going to pay the price? The Arabs. Okay, that's what they said. And we should hear them. Okay? By the way, the way to look at this, if we ever want to understand the conflict, is to realize that this is not a zero-sum game. You can have, where most of us are Jewish here, most of us are supporters of Israel. We can support Israel and love Israel and being extremely happy that Israel was founded in May of 1948. But at the same time, we can acknowledge that the Arabs paid a huge price. Okay? But the way they saw it was, we paid the price for the crimes of the Europeans. So this was not an anti-Jewish statement, it was anti-European. And when you heard recently, after October 7th, the arguments that Israel is another colonial state, it started back then, in which it said the big empires, meaning the British and the Americans, in order to gain something, they do it on the expense of the native population, of the indigenous population. Who was the indigenous population of Palestine? The Arabs. So they want to fix a situation. They don't care about the indigenous population, and they give at least half of our land to the Jews. Okay? So I think that if I were an Arab in 1947, I would have been really pissed off. Okay? They didn't get a fair share. Okay, just to sum up, they were the majority. There were 2/3 who got only 45% of the land, and they believed that the entire land was theirs to begin with. Okay? So this resentment has something to do, or a lot to do with reality. But that was the plan that was offered, and it's also known as UN Resolution 181. Something to remember, 181. So you see this map? If you want to look more carefully, the Jews got most of the coastal area. The only coastal area that the Arabs got was Gaza Strip. Okay, this is the Gaza Strip. Oh, you cannot see my cursor, so I will go to my pencil. Okay. Okay, so this is Gaza. Okay, so they got that, but the Jews, if you can see, I'll go to with another color now, because I'm so technically savvy. No, probably green is not good on blue, so I will choose hot pink. You see this, you see what I'm doing here? Think about the letter N. It's known, I know my drawing is not perfect. If you remember last week, I showed you the strategic way with which the Jews purchased land in Israel. They purchased this N, okay? It's not a perfect N, okay? But it's known in some documents and books as the N. So even before the committee came, the facts on the ground were that there was a Jewish area there, okay? And the Jews just got it because the Jews were there. They didn't own all the land there, but enough. Remember these little spots that we saw when I showed you how they kept establishing these little communities? That was the guideline, this N. So they had this N, and when the committee came, they said, oh, they're getting the N. And they gave the Jews also, what is this huge area? With it's green now, this is the Negev, which is a desert. Okay, today, the modern Israel learned how to use it well, but back then, it was just a desert. So even though it's large, it's still the desert. Okay, so this is a very important map. This was the recommendation of UNSCOP. I'll just go back to a map that I showed you a few weeks ago. with the Peel Committee from 1937. That's how they wanted to split the land between the Jews and the Arabs. You see, the green is a tiny Jewish place, and the, again, master, I guess, is the Arab state, and the red here is British. They wanted Jerusalem and a corridor to the sea. Okay? So this is the partition plan. Now, the UN had to vote on this partition plan. And the date of the vote originally was, and this is important just for the drama of the story, November 26th, 1947. It was Wednesday. You know what happened the Thursday after that Wednesday? Thanksgiving. Okay? That Wednesday, the UN was supposed to vote on the partition plan. Or in other words, the UN was about to vote whether or not the Jewish people will get their land. The problem was that the Jews had a majority, easily. But they needed more. They needed 2/3. And on that Wednesday, November 26th, they didn't have it. I'll pause here for a second. I told you that Truman wanted to help the Jews. However, the people who worked for Truman, many of them did not. And we're talking about two major entities who were vehemently against supporting a Jewish state. One of them was the State Department, and normally when it comes to issues like that, the president should listen to the State Department, especially what they call the Arabists in the State Department, those who dealt with the Middle East, or the Near East as they called it back then. And the other important entity was the Pentagon. They didn't want America to support a Jewish state. And they had some good reasons. Again, we try to put ourselves in the shoes of even the people we disagree with. And why is that? One reason was it's going to cause a chaos, because immediately there will be a war between the Jews and the Arabs, and bad stuff will happen. I even found a quote that some people said there will be a massacre of the Jews because the Arabs are so much more numerous, so much stronger, they will massacre the Jews, and then we, America, will have to intervene. Because we didn't do anything to help the Jews during the Holocaust, but now, 2 years later, we'll have to find ourselves fighting against, and that's not an American interest. Another reason against supporting it is the well-being and safety of Americans in Arab countries, because all the Arab countries were against it, naturally. There were many Americans, business people, religious people, missionaries, right? And they didn't want them to be attacked. And don't forget the Arab oil that started to be really important. Okay, they had the oil, so we need to be nice to them. And it was the beginning of the spirit of the Cold War. If we upset the Arabs, they will go with the Russians. And at that time, Russia and the US tried to get as many allies as they could. So if the US support a Jewish state in Palestine, Russia will get the Arab nations. Okay, so a lot of people said that the State Department people were anti-Semitic. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I don't really know. I didn't interview them. But they had some good reasons for looking at American interest to oppose it. But Truman listened to others, because not all of them, of course, had a consensus, but that was the majority. And the main person, by the way, who opposed it was no other than John Marshall, the famous one, okay? We don't need this mess, Truman supported it. But there's this difference between Truman supporting it and Truman putting pressure on other nations to support it. And this is why I paused on Wednesday, November 26, 1947. The Zionists in New York, it was actually in Queens at the time, not where the UN is today, realized that they don't have a majority. And the UN wanted to conclude the vote that day. So they employed the infamous filibuster and just kept talking and talking, trying to gain some more time. And when they ended, instead of continuing on Thursday, as the Arabs were hoping for, they decided that to honor the Americans, they should skip and let the Americans celebrate Thanksgiving. So the vote took place not on the 26th, but on the 29th of November. Okay, it's an important day. These 3 days, or 2 full days, gave the Zionists and their supporters enough time to persuade the Americans and to put pressure on some smaller countries to vote for a Jewish state. And one of them was Liberia, and several of them were Latin American countries, because there were many small Latin American countries, and some of them needed some bribes, some of them needed some threats. Even China was threatened back then by the US. And Truman decided to put his political capital and in supporting of that vote. So had the vote been taken on the 26th, it wouldn't have gotten the 2/3. On the 29th, the Zionists got it. And the UN approved, not a Jewish state, but 2 states. Okay, remember, it's super important to remember, 2 states. An Arab state alongside of a Jewish state.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized. There was heated debate in the Assembly. This is the delegate from Saudi Arabia arguing against partition.
ليس اليوم بيوم فلسطين وحدها.
Then Senor Arana of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
And this was the scene next day in Jerusalem. The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. Such was the immediate Jewish reaction in Jerusalem, and it was the same in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. The Arab reaction was to follow. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting, and bloodshed. Isolated police were more or less powerless to deal with the riot, which, beginning as a demonstration, quickly led to the burning of Jewish shops and the general destruction of Jewish property. During this time, fighting between Arabs and Jews was a commonplace occurrence, and there were many casualties on both sides through stabbing and shooting. And arrests were made on both sides. Here are some Jews being taken into custody after a rooftop chase. Grenades and revolvers were freely used by the rioters. Fires were soon blazing in many places throughout Jerusalem. The burning of the Rex cinema is typical. The implementing of the United Nations decision is the big query. Meanwhile, Britain announces the ending of her mandate next May.
Okay, one time is enough. All right, enough. Okay, this is quite beautiful. Yes.
The question I have is, why did they come up with some yellow over there, some yellow over there, blue over there? Why didn't they just divide it so it could be more?
It was based partly on where there were concentrations of Jews versus Arabs, okay? And initially, not in that, not in this particular plan, they even suggested swapping of populations. Because in the Jewish state, for example, there were hundreds of thousands of Arabs, and vice versa. But mostly Arabs in the Jewish area and not so many Jews in the Arab area. Okay, if you remember some of the maps that we looked at from Sykes-Picot, from after World War I, we saw that the British really liked, or this is not a British, but they just love to draw lines on maps. And that's why the Middle East is still a mess. Okay, and will probably be a mess for a long time because many of these countries, as we mentioned, were all new, were all artificially created with a pencil and a ruler. And okay, so this idea of partitioning happened all the time, not only in that area, but that's the way they decided, you know, after their investigation. I want to do, so that was November 29th. The British heard the results of the vote. By the way, both the US and the USSR supported Israel at the time. Okay, later on, the Russians were not friends with Israel, but at that time they supported the creation of a Jewish land in Israel. That was November, end of November 47, and the British said that in 6 months, May 14th, 48, they are getting out of the land. Didn't leave the inhabitants of the land a lot of time to organize. But one of the reasons that the Jews got more, and the ANSCO, this committee, thought that the Jewish people at least can have a state, is something I mentioned a few times in the past. What the Jews did, since they had the critical mass, was to establish like state-like entities. So the Haganah was de facto a military. The Haganah had about 70 to 80,000 soldiers, or at least soldiers they could mobilize, okay? They have other important social and economic institutions, and of course political. So the Jews handled themselves for many years at that time like a state, without the recognition of a state, but they knew what they were doing. Okay, it's called the Jewish Agency. Ben-Gurion was the head of it. It was a whole political structure, whole social, okay, they knew what they were doing. So for them, for the Jews, to say, okay, bye British, we know what we're doing now, was not hard. It was almost impossible for the Arabs. They never established any of these institutions. And they were not unified. On May 14th, and that's where we'll continue in the future, as the British were leaving, Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the State of Israel. I will tell the story some other time. It's a very moving story. It's a beautiful story. He did it in Tel Aviv. Okay, the capital of Israel initially was in Tel Aviv. Should have stayed there, but that's my prejudice. No, many people in Israel divide. Either you like Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. You cannot like them both. So I want to skip. I don't want to talk about the war today because we don't have time. But since we started with a ship, I want to end today with a ship and a little story that I told probably 15 years ago in a sermon that, of course, everyone remembers. But I want to tell you this story. You see the burning ship? It's called the Altalena. So I said a lot about how fractured the Arabs were, right? They had different families, the Nashashibi and the Husseinis, and different, they were fighting, infight. The Jews were united, sort of, okay? There were 3 paramilitary groups that I mentioned in the past weeks. One is the Haganah, that was the big one, okay? The Haganah had a special unit that was called the Palmach. Somebody asked me about it, so, okay. That was their special unit, the commando unit of the Haganah. And I mentioned there were about 70, or they were able to mobilize some 70 to 80,000 people. Not bad, because the Jewish population in 1948 were 650,000 people. Okay, so it's a huge number. Another paramilitary group that didn't like the Haganah was the Irgun, headed by Menachem Begin. Okay, they were much more militant. They didn't want partition, they wanted the Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan, meaning they wanted also to occupy what back then was called Transjordan, and today is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Okay, and they were very militant. This is the group that bombed the King David hotel that we talked about last week, killed a lot of British and other people. And they had their group, something between 2,000 and 5,000 combatants. And there was the Stern gang that was extremist, really, but tiny, like a few hundred people. When Ben-Gurion declared the foundation of Israel, Haganah became de facto the IDF. But the Irgun did not want to join them. They wanted to have an independent military organization. I don't know how many of you studied political science or sociology, but one of the first classes that you learn is you read Max Weber. And the way that Max Weber, the German sociologist, defined a state is his first condition for a group or a geographical entity to be a state is to have, in his words, a monopoly over means of violence. Okay? Means of violence meaning weapon. Only the state can have serious weapon. You cannot have another military group along the side of the state. There is one army, okay? If you have more than one, this is not really a state. I'll just tell you that the biggest problem in Lebanon is that they have many little armies, okay? They have the Lebanese army, the official one, but they also have Hezbollah, which we look at it as a terrorist organization, but de facto is another military, okay? And that contradicts what Max Weber teaches us. A country to become a state must have a monopoly over means of violence. The Irgun did not want to join the IDF. And a very short time. It was in June of 48, right? Israel was founded May of 48, in June 11th, actually. They were able to buy a ship by the name of Altalena and put a lot of weapon on it, different kind of weapon, and some soldiers on it. And the ship sailed to Israel. Now it's Israel, no longer Palestine. We can say Israel and be accurate. Ben-Gurion said, okay, this weapon, this munition is going to the IDF. Begin, the head of the Irgun, said, no, this weapon, or a lot of it, is going to our Jerusalem Brigade. That's what they call this sub-organization they had. And Ben-Gurion, who was extremely smart, and I'm sure read Weber, said, no way. And they argued, and Ben-Gurion told the IDF, no more Haganah, right? That was the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, to bomb the ship with the weapon that the Etzel, the Irgun, sent. And that was a moment in which Israel was on a cusp of a civil war. This is an amazing story, okay? Because the IDF in this case, just you see the picture here. And it was in Tel Aviv, so people were standing there watching. You can see in this picture, there are many pictures like that, because that's what they saw. And Begin had to decide, am I fighting now with Ben-Gurion or not? And he chose not to. And by choosing not to, and for the Irgun to join the IDF, that was the end of this potentially tremendously dangerous risk of a civil war. But I wanted to know this little story of the Altalena, because that was a moment of uncertainty. Nobody knew what Begin would do. So the Jews who just signed a ceasefire with the Arabs after defeating them almost started a civil war. But Ben-Gurion decided that he has to start from the very beginning to insist on, again, what Weber will call, did call, he lived in the 1800s, monopoly over means of violence. There is only one army, and one army that is controlled by the government. I will not allow two armies, he said, and was right. He took a risk, and it paid off. Okay, so that was 3 weeks after the Declaration of Independence, but this is a very important moment that is still mentioned in Israel, because when there is a strife and people are talking about an Altalena moment, when there is a fear of a civil war or something along these lines. So I think I will end with that. We started with a ship, the Exodus, that some say that since the UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee of Palestine, witnessed the cruelty of the British, who refused to allow these poor Holocaust survivors to enter the land, it really affected them, and they came up with the partition plan, certainly in favor of the Jews. It's because of this Exodus. And so I wanted to balance it off with another ship, the Altalena, that was the beginning, the real beginning of the State of Israel. Are we going to be like many of the new Arab countries, of different armies, different groups fighting all the time, or we're going to be a united group that, of course, will have a lot of inner fighting, like every state has to have, but when it comes to serious issues, we are together. And that's what they chose. And that's where we will end today. So I hope that you learned something in the past many weeks. And next week we're taking a week off, and then we're going to suffer together if you want to join me. This is really fascinating. It ignites different parts of the brain and the heart. And then we'll continue with Zionism and other stuff. Thank you, my friends. See you whenever.